The Exodus.
The Exodus, I think, is the greatest story in the Old Testament. It's an amazing story.
It begins with the flight from Egypt and the parting of the Red Sea. The climax is Mount Sinai.
It's where heaven meets earth.
It's where God gives Moses the Ten Commandments.
Mount Sinai is the place where Moses receives the biblical laws that still govern much of our civilized world today.
So it is the most important mountain in the Bible.
For thousands of years, people have wondered about the route of the Exodus and the exact location of Mount Sinai. But many experts believe it's a futile exercise.
We've got no archaeological evidence for an Exodus event.
People trying to find things like the real Mount Sinai are essentially wasting their time.
But one man dares to think otherwise. He believes that the Exodus took a different path, and Mount Sinai is somewhere else altogether. Somewhere so dangerous, it's impossible to reach. If he's right, pilgrims have been climbing up the wrong mountain for thousands of years. This is the story of Sir Colin Humphrey's journey to find the real route of the Exodus and the true Mountain of God. Cambridge, England. Sir Colin Humphreys is the Director of Research in Material Science at Cambridge University. But he's also fascinated by the science of the Bible.
When my younger daughter was 8 years old, my father gave her a book called Great Men of History. And it gave the date of their birth and the date of their death. And against Jesus, it put date of birth 4 BC question mark, date of death AD 30 question mark. And my daughter said, "Daddy, why is only Jesus the person in this book whose dates of birth and death are unknown?" So I thought that's a great question, and that's what started me thinking about biblical matters.
Sir Colin is a man of faith. But as a man of science, he thinks the story of the Exodus is full of anomalies. Sir Colin starts his journey in 1995 on Mount Sinai. At its foot lies St. Catherine's Monastery. Hundreds of pilgrims climb the mountain. They come here because this is said to be the holy mountain where God handed Moses the Ten Commandments. Among the pilgrims is Sir Colin Humphreys.
I visited Mount Sinai, the traditional Mount Sinai, in the spring of 1995.
For the pilgrims, it's an uplifting experience. But Sir Colin is racked with doubts.
People were praying at the top, and they were singing hymns and obviously having some emotional experience. I felt slightly guilty. I thought, you know, I should be having some emotional experience like as these other people are. This should be a great place. So I started thinking, this cannot be the real Mount Sinai. I wonder where the real Mount Sinai is.
Back in Cambridge, Sir Colin reviews the traditional route of the Exodus and the location of Mount Sinai. The accepted view is that the Israelites leave Egypt, make their way south, and arrive at Mount Sinai, on the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula. But if the location of Mount Sinai is wrong, then the route of the whole Exodus may be wrong too. To discover the real direction of the Exodus and the true setting of Mount Sinai, Sir Colin looks for clues in the original story. The Bible says the Israelites have been slaves in Egypt for centuries. One day Moses, in exile near Mount Sinai, hears the voice of God in a burning bush. God sends him to deliver the Israelites from slavery and take them to the promised land. Moses confronts Pharaoh, but Pharaoh refuses to let his slaves go free. So Moses unleashes 10 plagues on Egypt. Dead fish, dead cattle, lice, flies, and locusts. Moses sends plagues of hail and darkness. These plagues are the prelude to the most terrible plague of all, the death of the firstborn. At last, Pharaoh relents. What the Bible calls the Exodus begins. Sir Colin notes that the Israelites left in their thousands from Ramesses in the eastern delta. They were led east by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. But Pharaoh reneges on his promise and leads his army to hunt the Israelites down. It was then that the greatest miracle in the Old Testament occurred. Moses parts the Red Sea. The Hebrews escape. And Pharaoh's army is drowned by the returning waves. But if the Hebrews thought they were safe, they were wrong. The wilderness is scorching and arid. They face death through dehydration. But then, on the slopes of Mount Sinai, Moses uses his staff to miraculously bring water gushing from a rock. Moses ascends the mountain and receives the 10 Commandments from God. But when Moses returns, he discovers that the Israelites have lost their faith. God's punishment is unforgiving.
But because of their complaining and their rebelling, God condemns them to travel in the wilderness for another 40 years.
This is what troubles Sir Colin. How could the whole nation of Israel have survived for 40 years in this barren wilderness with little food and water? And how could they have got lost?
Sinai Peninsula is very small, and wandering around that small region for 40 years is pretty inconceivable. If you're going to get lost in a desert and wander around, it has to be a bigger area of land.
Sir Colin begins to wonder if this really is Mount Sinai. The idea is only 1800 years old.
In the 3rd century AD, there were a small group of Christian hermits living at Jebel Musa. Some were living in caves, some in tents, and they got together one day and they said, "We believe this is Mount Sinai." And it's a very late tradition, over 1,000 years after the Exodus events.
Associating Mount Sinai with a particular mountain in the Sinai Peninsula is pure guesswork.
There's no factual basis for this being Mount Sinai.
People trying to find the real Mount Sinai are essentially wasting their time. No professional archaeologist ever joins these expeditions. There's no point to it. If you want to go search for it, knock yourself out, have fun, but don't expect an archaeologist to come with you. We have, frankly, better things to do.
But Sir Colin is convinced that science can discover the real Mount Sinai. Although a man of faith, Sir Colin decides to combine his interests in geology and geography to discover the real Mount Sinai. His method is to begin with the start of the Exodus and follow the trail to see where it takes him. The Bible says the Israelites leave from a city called Ramesses in the eastern Nile Delta.
The book of Exodus talks about the city of Pi-Ramesses, which was the resident city built by King Ramesses II in the northeast delta. And its location fits in very nicely with, if you've got a group who are leaving Egypt, that's the direction they would leave from.
That gives Sir Colin the start of the Exodus. According to the Bible, the first stop is Sukkoth.
The Egyptian equivalent is a place called El Mashkuta, and so archaeologists are agreed on that. And interestingly, it's just 25 miles from Ramesses, so they would have done this journey in a day.
Sir Colin is on the right track. But the Israelites' next destination is harder to pin down. The Bible names it as Etham.
Like so many of the places mentioned in Exodus, Etham only exists in the text of the Bible. There have been speculations about where it might actually be, but there is absolutely zero objective evidence on which to base any equation.
Sir Colin finds that many Bible atlases assume that the Exodus advanced south along the west of the Sinai Peninsula, and so suggest Etham is somewhere between Sukkoth and Mount Sinai. But Sir Colin disagrees.
Etham has been undiscovered so long because I think biblical scholars have been looking in the wrong place. People have assumed that because Sukkoth is 1 day's journey from Ramesses, Etham is 1 day's journey from Sukkoth. But the Bible doesn't say that. It doesn't say it's just a day's journey away. And so I look further afield.
Sir Colin pores over an old map from 1879. To the east of the Sinai Desert, he notices a place called El Yittim Peak. It's an unlikely stopover. El Yittim is 180 miles from Sukkoth. But in Hebrew, El Yittim can also be pronounced Etham. If this is the biblical Etham, How did the Israelites get there? Sir Colin is amazed to find that the text actually tells us.
The Bible tells us that the Israelites went to Etna, but they used what's called the desert road to the Red Sea. The desert road to the Red Sea, if you look in ancient literature, was a well-known trade route, which went from the top of the Gulf of Suez across the top of the Sinai Peninsula.
If Sir Colin is right, the Israelites may well have bypassed the traditional site of Mount Sinai. So where was the real Mount Sinai? The next milestone in the Exodus is the parting of the Red Sea. But where did this miracle actually take place? The Bible does not say. Traditionally, it's assumed the Israelites crossed the Red Sea at the head of the Gulf of Suez. To find the true crossing place, Sir Colin looks for clues in the original Hebrew version of the Bible.
When I was at school, I had a religious education teacher called Major Evans, and he said, the translation Red Sea is the biggest mistranslation in the Bible. And the reason he said that is because the Hebrew is Yam Suf, and Yam means sea, and Suf means reeds.
Yam Suf, which means Sea of Reeds, has been translated as Red Sea. So those who would quote the Hebrew text would say that it has to be an expanse of water that has reeds.
But where was this Sea of Reeds? Sir Colin finds that the Hebrew Bible mentions the Reed Sea, or Yam Suf, in another context.
There's a killer clue in the Bible which enables us to identify precisely where Yam Suf is, and this concerns where King Solomon built his ships.
The Book of Kings says that Solomon built his ships at a place called Ezion-Geber on the shores of the Red Sea.
This would give another possible location for the sea crossing, which is on the eastern side of the Sinai Peninsula.
That would put the parting of the Red Sea not in the Gulf of Suez on the west of the peninsula, but in the Gulf of Aqaba. (1999), Aqaba. Sir Colin arrives to explore the area. The city is Jordan's gateway to the Red Sea. It's directly opposite Eilat, the famous Israeli resort. As a scientist, Sir Colin is not expecting to find reeds in the salt water. But while exploring some ancient ruins a mere 200 yards from the waterfront, Sir Colin spies a clump of vegetation. It stands 6 feet tall in the water.
When I saw these reeds, I was just amazed. How could reeds grow at the head of the Gulf of Aqaba? The water there is not salt water, as you might expect. It's fresh water because it's all channeled down from the mountains. And so reeds grow right at the head of the Gulf of Aqaba. The ancients, the Hebrews, they called this the Sea of Reeds because it was so unusual to see reeds growing at the head of a salty sea.
Sir Colin explores the outlying area looking for more reeds. He is now just yards from the Israeli border. Sentries watch his every move. The last thing he wants is to cause an international incident. Sir Colin decides to leave before he is arrested. Sitting on the beach, overlooking the Gulf of Aqaba, Sir Colin takes stock of his progress so far. He's traced the march of the Israelites to the very edge of the Gulf of Aqaba. To find the real Mount Sinai, he must now get the Israelites across the Reed Sea. But how? The Bible says the Red Sea crossing was a miracle. An east wind parted the waters. As a scientist, Sir Colin believes there could be a natural explanation for the miracle. A powerful wind can raise the sea, known as a storm surge. But it can also lower the sea.
A strong east wind blowing along the Gulf of Aqaba all night would cause what scientists call a wind set down, which means that the water is forced back from the shore.
This wind set-down effect could have created the wall of water described by the Bible.
When the wind stops blowing, this wall of water comes rushing back, and it comes rushing back in a very special form. It's called a bore wave. And Pharaoh's army was drowned, just as the Bible describes.
Sir Colin has traced a new Exodus route. From Ramesses in Egypt all the way to the head of the Gulf of Aqaba. He's closer than ever to finding the real Mount Sinai. But now, he's at a crossroads. All the Bible says is that they head back into the desert.
After the Red Sea, they go into the wilderness. There are debates among scholars as to exactly what the route was. Some favor a southerly route.
The traditional view would say that the Israelites went southwest to the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula. But Sir Colin already knows that cannot be the real Mount Sinai. The only other option is southeast, to the forbidding wilderness of the Arabian desert. Sir Colin knows that an Arabian setting for Mount Sinai will challenge the accepted view of the route of the Exodus. He has to proceed with care. He checks the next stop of the flight from Egypt. After crossing the Reed Sea, the Bible says the Israelites walked for 3 days before finding water. And then they arrived at a spring called Marah.
Marah is a Hebrew word that means bitter.
Here, the water is undrinkable. But where was this spring? For Sir Colin, it will be difficult to explore the deserts of Arabia. But he doesn't have to. He knows of a man who already has. Alois Musil. He was an early 20th century adventurer from what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Musil was born in Moravia, in 1868, and he was to become possibly one of the greatest explorers of the Middle East. He was a biblical scholar, he was ordained a priest, he was fluent in many, many languages, and he single-handedly mapped great uncharted territories.
Sir Colin finds that Musil's diaries contain many clues that help him follow the route of the Exodus. Musil's journey took him to the northern Hejaz, to the east of Aqaba, an area of modern-day Saudi Arabia. Like the Israelites, Musil trekked across the desert from the head of the Gulf of Aqaba. He also ran out of water. Then at last, after precisely 3 days, he came upon a spring called the Well of Al-Malha.
Al-Malha is the same place in Arabic as Mara is in Hebrew, and they both mean bitter. I think that Musil was unwittingly following the route of the Exodus.
He was not on a quest to try to retread the footsteps of the Exodus, but he would have been looking for evidence of the Exodus, and he would have had that in his head with all his studies.
Sir Colin believes he's traced the actual trail of the Exodus. From Ramesses in Egypt to Mara in the Arabian desert. The real Mount Sinai must be somewhere in this wilderness. But where? In one of the hottest places on Earth, Sir Colin's trail goes cold. (2002), Italy. Sir Colin is on a field trip to the island of Sicily. It's meant to be a break from his quest. But the trip gives Sir Colin a lead that could help him pinpoint the location of Mount Sinai. Sicily may be home to the best pasta in the world, but it's also home to Europe's most active volcano, Mount Etna. Sir Colin decides to climb the volcano.
We went up Mount Etna with a guide. I noticed the air just shimmering above my feet. I asked the guide, and he said it's a volcanic vent. And he got some paper out of his pocket, and he just put this paper on top of this volcanic vent, and it instantly caught fire and burnt.
You can get really hot gas coming out of those fractures. So gases which would be at many hundreds of degrees, and certainly high enough temperatures to cause vegetation to combust spontaneously.
This volcanic phenomenon reminds Sir Colin of Moses on Mount Sinai. When he heard the voice of God.
This is a scientific explanation of the burning bush, that there was a volcanic vent underneath. And what we do know is that certain types of acacia do turn to charcoal when they're burnt, and it's found all over the Arabian deserts. The whole story fits together, that the bush would burn, it would form this charcoal framework, it wouldn't collapse, and the flames would keep on coming through it because of the gas being continuously supplied.
For Sir Colin, the implications are far-reaching. If the miracle of the burning bush happened on the slopes of a volcano, then was Mount Sinai itself a volcano? The Bible never once mentions a volcano. And yet, when Sir Colin looks again, he discovers that indirectly, it does. Moses and the Israelites are led out of Egypt, guided by a pillar of smoke by day and a pillar of fire by night.
As a scientist, I knew that a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire is what you get from volcanoes.
The descriptions that we see in Exodus are certainly can be interpreted in terms of a volcanic eruption.
When I realized Mount Sinai was a volcano, I thought, this is amazing, because so much then fits together. That's a huge feeling of elation, really, to discover this.
At last, Sir Colin has a hot lead. Mount Sinai could be a volcano. But are there any volcanoes in the Arabian desert? Sir Colin checks out Volcanoes of the World. It's a massive tome listing every volcano that has erupted in the last 10,000 years.
When I looked in Volcanoes of the World, the first thing I did was to see if there were volcanoes in the Sinai Peninsula. And there were no volcanoes that have erupted in the last 10,000 years in the Sinai Peninsula, which was a huge relief.
The Sinai Peninsula is not volcanic. There are no young volcanoes on the peninsula at all. The rocks there include some rocks that are volcanic, but they're ancient geologically, so hundreds of millions of years old.
For Sir Colin, if there are no volcanoes in the Sinai Peninsula, then the traditional site of Mount Sinai must be wrong. So what of the Arabian Peninsula? Here, in complete contrast, Sir Colin finds an embarrassment of riches. Dozens and dozens of volcanoes.
There are a lot of active volcanoes in Saudi Arabia. It's just riddled with active volcanoes. And so I thought, gosh, I'm now looking for a needle in a haystack sort of problem.
But could Mount Sinai really be in the Arabian wilderness? These volcanoes are up to 300 miles from Egypt. Could the Israelites have even seen a volcanic plume from this far away? Medina, 1256 AD. Medieval records show that a volcano erupted in the Arabian Peninsula. Luckily for Sir Colin, people reported seeing the eruption. Not just in Arabia, but hundreds of miles away.
In something like 1200 AD, a volcano erupted near Medina in Saudi Arabia. It shot a pillar of fire in the air, and this pillar of fire was seen from Syria, 500 miles away. Now, the Sinai Peninsula is only about 300 miles away. We can be certain, I think, that a pillar of fire erupting in Saudi Arabia would have been seen by the Israelites as they crossed the top of the Sinai Peninsula.
To find out which volcano is Mount Sinai, all Sir Colin now needs to do is to get to Saudi Arabia. He consults with the country's embassy in London. But he soon finds there's one problem.
Having found that there are many volcanoes in Saudi Arabia, I was keen to visit. When I looked into this, I could not get a tourist visa to visit. You could only get a business visa, and you had to be invited in, and I had no way of doing this.
Unable to visit Arabia, Sir Colin has to look for Mount Sinai in some other way. He decides to see if the Bible and science together can help him find the right volcano. In the final leg of their journey, the Israelites travel from Mount Sinai itself to the Promised Land. It says they travel via a place called Kadesh Barnea.
There's a very interesting verse in the Bible, in the book of Deuteronomy, and it said it's an 11 days journey from Kadesh Barnea to Mount Sinai.
We might know where Kadesh Barnea is. A number of sites have been proposed, but the usual suggestion is that it's a site in an oasis called Ein Kudes.
Looking at the map, Sir Colin sees that Ein Kudes is right on the Israeli-Egyptian border. Sir Colin now has a reference point. He can work out how far away the volcano is from here. He calculates the maximum distance the Israelites could have traveled in 11 days. 400 miles.
So I got a pair of compasses, drew a circle on a map, and found out how many volcanoes might be within this circle.
Mount Sinai could be within 400 miles of Ein Kudes. The Sinai Peninsula, of course, is within the radius, but bereft of volcanoes. But in the Arabian Peninsula, 3 active volcanoes fall within the 400-mile radius. Mount Raha, Mount Ishkar, and Mount Beda. One of these could be the real Mount Sinai. But which? (1980), Washington State, USA. On May the 18th, 1980, the eruption of Mount St. Helens causes devastation for hundreds of miles around. It's the deadliest eruption in American history. And according to a measure known as the Volcanic Explosivity Index, it's also one of the biggest.
The Volcanic Explosivity Index, or VEI, is a very simple shorthand way of classifying volcanic eruptions by size that was introduced by some geologists in the late 1970s.
For Sir Colin, the explosivity index could be the key that reveals the true Mount Sinai. The first 2 volcanoes, Raha and Ishkar, both have an explosivity index of 0.
Raha and Ishkar were not explosive volcanic eruptions, so they would not have put a large pillar of fire and a large pillar of cloud into the sky.
Mount Beda is a much bigger volcano. It sits 500 feet proud above a plateau, which itself is 5,000 feet above sea level. Crucially, its explosivity index is 2. The height of its column could have been at least 3 miles high, just like Mount St. Helens.
Mount Beda was an explosive eruption which would have sent a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire significant height into the atmosphere, and so I thought this has to be the only possibility.
The height of the column of smoke means a Mount Beda eruption could have been seen hundreds of miles away in Egypt. Could Mount Beda be Mount Sinai? Unable to go and investigate Mount Beda, Sir Colin has no choice but to study the volcano remotely. Geological studies of the area reveal that the plateau Mount Beda sits upon is a huge sandstone rock.
Sandstone or limestone is porous, and if it rains, water comes out of the sides. And all over the world we have aquifers, and these are porous rocks beneath ground level, and they store a lot of water. Mount Beda is 6 miles across, so just a huge sandstone rock which would have stored a huge amount of water.
For Sir Colin, that is a vital clue. It could explain the setting of one of Moses' miracles. The Bible says that when the Israelites were thirsty, Moses struck a rock and water gushed out. It says the miracle happened at Mount Sinai. That means Mount Sinai was not only a volcano, it was also a vast store of rainwater, just like Mount Beda. Sir Colin is wary of using a miracle to confirm the location of Mount Sinai. Could he find a natural explanation for it? 1917, the Egyptian desert. The British Army are locked in battle with the Ottoman forces. The Imperial Camel Corps is a key part of the fight. One of its officers keeps a diary of his adventures. The diary says the Camel Corps were digging for water. The sergeant then seized a pickaxe and smashed a rock. Out came a great gush of clear water. His men hailed him with shouts of, "What ho, the prophet Moses." Sir Colin thinks he knows what happened here.
In the desert, you have desert storms where sand is blown around at high speed by the wind, and the sand abrades the surface of the rocks, and it forms a hard crust on the rock.
When the sergeant cracked the crust of the rock, the water flowed out.
So what Moses is doing, when he gives this rock a real hit with his staff, then he breaks the crust and the water comes flowing out. And this is an effect known to geologists. So this thing, which I first thought was an impossibility, the miracle has a really good scientific explanation.
If Moses' miracle on Mount Sinai actually happened, then it must have happened on a mountain that stored vast amounts of water, just like Mount Beda. The two mountains must be one and the same. Sir Colin is more certain than ever that Mount Beda is Mount Sinai. There's just one final matter to settle. Could the area around Mount Beda have supported hundreds of thousands of Israelites as the Bible claims? Sir Colin is unable to go to Arabia and check for himself. But again, Alois Musil had the answer.
Musil visited Mount Bedir, and he recorded that the vegetation and the plants he saw were the most luxurious he had seen in his travels. And the reason is it's just very well watered. So the Israelites could easily have survived there. There was water for them to survive for at least a year.
Equating Mount Sinai with Mount Bedir would even explain why the Israelites spend 40 years wandering in the wilderness.
Mount Bedir is in a fairly remote part of Arabia, and it's quite easy to see how they could have got lost when they left. It's a large region. I mean, Arabia is a large country, so you could easily have wandered there for 40 years before emerging into the Promised Land.
For Sir Colin, Mount Bedir in the Arabian desert is the most convincing candidate for the Mountain of God.
There have been many other suggested Mount Sinai's. It seems to me the evidence is clear-cut that Mount Sinai was a volcano. And none of the other mountains suggested to have been volcanoes, so I would rule them all out on that basis alone.
For me, it's an entirely plausible hypothesis to interpret the writings in Exodus in terms of a volcanic eruption.
But the notion that Mount Sinai is a volcano does not impress Bible experts.
This pseudo-scientific approach to trying to identify Mount Sinai as a volcano is completely irrelevant when it comes to biblical scholarship. The idea of a deity whose presence is announced with smoke and fire and quaking is a very common way to describe lots of other deities in the ancient Near East. So Sinai doesn't have to be a mountain that's volcanic.
Sir Colin Humphrey's theory that Mount Sinai was a volcano is as good as any other. If you're trying to find something that's a pillar of fire by night and smoke by day, a volcano fits the description. But beyond that, there's no particular proof one way or the other.
For Sir Colin, only one other thing can prove beyond any reasonable doubt that Mount Bedir is Mount Sinai. That it erupted exactly at the time of the Exodus.
If that lava was, about 3,000 years old, then that's a strong pointer that Mount Bedir erupted at the time of the Exodus.
But until Saudi Arabia welcomes Bible scholars, that must remain a forlorn hope.
I would love to see Mount Bedir. I think it looks increasingly likely this is the real Mount Sinai, and hopefully we'll be able to test it one day using science.
In the meantime, Sir Colin will remain convinced that the Bible describes Mount Sinai as a volcano.
The description of Mount Sinai in the Bible as a volcano is the earliest description of a volcano in any ancient literature. Mount Bedir to the Israelites would have been really impressive because they would have seen it erupting. Fires on the top, smoke's coming out. Just an enormously impressive sight. You'd hear the rumble of earthquakes going on. And then God speaks to Moses. It's just such a dramatic setting. Frightening, I think, terrifying, and also awe-inspiring.
Truly, the Mountain of God.